you.
Okay, so a quick reprise then. I'm Maura McCarkindale. I'm the chair of the Unlock Our Future Fund panel, which is the decision-making panel for the community fund associated with the Vattenfall wind farm off the coast of Aberdeen. We have with us B. Jefferson from Community, sorry, excuse me, get a message here, from Foundation Scotland, who is going to talk about the terms of the fund, the application process and the timescales, and Rachel Smith from NESCAN, who is going to tell us about the work of NESCAN and the funds that they manage. We're very happy to take questions, but what I'd suggest is if you're familiar with the chat function in Zoom, that you put your questions in the chat if you've got them during the presentation. That means we'll capture them and they won't get forgotten, and we will deal with them, and there will be time at the end for questions. So B, would you like to introduce yourself first and before we move into the main presentation?
So my name is B. Jefferson. I work for Foundation Scotland, who administer the fund. So we do things such as managing the applications. We review the applications that come in before making recommendations to the panel who actually make the decisions on the fund. So I'll be talking today a little bit about the application process, how we do assessments, the sort of things we're looking for in assessments, so that when you're putting together the application, you can cover off.
Someone's asking if they can see you, please.
Oh,
we can't see you.
Can you not see me? I shall.
No.
Can you see me now? I've got some nods. Yes.
I can't, but never mind. I know what you look like.
Okay, so I'll be filling you in on the sort of mechanisms of applying and how to actually shape your application in a way that makes sure it meets our requirements.
Okay, that's fine. And Rachel, could you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Rachel from NESCAN. I'm a funding and development officer, and I've been in post less than a year, so I'm still learning, but had a baptism of fire with the NESCAN Seed Fund and a partnership project for green participatory budgeting as part of the Just Transition Fund. So I can tell you a bit about those.
Thank you, B and Rachel. So B, shall we start the presentation? Okay, the Unlock Our Future Fund has a specific geographic area, which is Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire. I mentioned that it's associated with the Aberdeen offshore wind farm, and it's actually the money is provided by Vattenfall, who own and operate the wind farm. So the fund value is £150,000 per annum. That is index linked. So of course it's year one was 150,000. So it's a bit more than that now. It's every year for the life of the wind farm, which is anticipated to be 22 years. Sorry, B, they applied for an extension. They went for 22 years. They went for an extension of life. A certain proportion, 10%, is set aside specifically for the Black Dog community, as that's the community that hosts the substation. Next slide, please. So there are four main criteria or four main aims of the fund. There are some what we call cross-cutting themes that B will explain later on. But basically, the real intention is climate smart. So really carbon reduction. However, we're also trying to, rather clunky phrases, we're trying to build capacity in communities to make them more resilient, richer, better places to live. And we had quite a lot of applications for community spaces and transport. We talk about creative solutions. We're not looking for blue sky. We're just looking for maybe something applied in a way it hasn't been done before, or a replication or something like that. And if you want a further conversation with Bea about what creative solutions mean or what they might mean in the context of your project, then I'm sure she'll be happy to talk to you. And we're looking for some kind of legacy and impact, you know, something that will endure. Next slide, Bea. So these are just a few examples of projects that we've funded in the past. So starting at the top, that's the Meldrum Amenities Group, who have taken over the upkeep and maintenance of floral displays in Old Meldrum. And so they were funded for an electric vehicle to support that. Going clockwise, the next one is Seafine. That's a cargo bike for delivering their food parcels. Then we have Peterhead Sailing Club, solar panels and a recharging point. Solar panels for their clubhouse and a recharging point for a vehicle. And the last one is the barn in Bankery. That's their old lighting system, but they received funding to replace the lights with LEDs. I think it's over to you now, Bea, isn't it?
It is. So let me just spotlight myself and take you off spotlight. So hopefully people can see me. So I'm going to be talking a bit about the whole mechanism of applying to the fund. So there are two sizes of grants that are available. There's small grants that are up to £2,000. They have a slightly different process to the larger grants, a slightly shorter decision-making process. Often they are used for funding things like feasibility studies, getting in some expert help on a project, or some small-scale energy improvements. The large grants are up to £15,000 in any 1 year and up to £30,000 over 3 years. To be eligible to apply, you have to be a community organisation with a constitution that has charitable objectives. So you don't have to be a registered charity, but you do need to have charitable objectives. You need to have a management committee that has at least 3 members. You need a bank account. There are certain things we're not allowed to fund, and this is across all Foundation Scotland funds. It's not just this fund. So there are restrictions on funding certain religious undertakings and any activity that is deemed to be the responsibility of a statutory body. Now, in the case of this fund, that tends to cause issues, firstly with buildings that are owned by religious organisations. So we're not allowed to fund improvements to a building that's used exclusively for purposes of religious worship and is only accessible to people of a particular faith. But we can fund buildings that are used for wider community use. So if an organisation is applying who are a religious organisation, it's really helpful to have in your application something about how the building is used by the wider community. If you can give us any facts and figures about the other groups that use it, about who else uses it, that's very useful, so we can make sure that you're eligible. But also with statutory bodies, we can't fund things if they're the responsibility of somebody such as a local authority. So, for example, we couldn't fund improvements to a local authority-owned school building because that would be local authority responsibility. But we could fund a community group improving a building that's owned by the local authority, but on a long-term lease to a community group, because that way the community group is the one getting the benefit from the grant. But if you have any queries about eligibility, and particularly those two matters, please get in contact and we can make sure that we're clear on the eligibility before you spend time putting in an application form. We do allow repeat applications, though this fund has been very much oversubscribed. So the panel have said that they may decide to prioritise new organisations depending on the level of applications we have for the fund. The fund's now open. You can now put in applications. It closes on the 17th of April. So there's still quite a while to work on applications. So before you apply, please read the guidance. On the Foundation Scotland website, there's a fund page that has a summary of the fund, and there's also a link there to a document that actually has a lot more detail in it. It's called the Fund Strategy. It also has examples of projects we funded over the past 4 years. So if you want to get more detailed information about the fund, please go to that Fund Strategy. Also, please ask questions. I'm available for help either over the phone or online. I'm going to be out and about in Aberdeen and Aberdeenshire on the 15th and 16th of March. I'm going to be in Banchory on the 15th in the morning, and then in Aberdeen on the afternoon and evening of the 15th, and then in Huntly on the 16th. If you'd like to meet face-to-face and discuss an application, please book in a slot. On the website, there's a link to my diary that shows the slots that are available. So please book in a slot. If you can't make any of those days, book in a telephone conversation or an online meeting. So I'm there to answer any questions you have. But there's plenty of other organisations that can provide support as well, particularly if you have projects that are around community buildings. So Local Energy Scotland, they provide advice, support and funding. And Rachel will be saying a little bit more about some of the funding they can offer. There's also Business Energy Scotland. They provide free energy audits of buildings. They also have access to various loan schemes and cashback grant schemes. They do have quite a long waiting list to do their building audits. So if you are thinking of a project involving a building, please get in touch with them sooner rather than later to get an assessment. There's also things such as your third sector interface organisations, Aberdeenshire Voluntary Action, ACVO, who can provide funding support and more generic support as well about your organisation and organisational development. And there's people like the Aberdeenshire Rural Partnerships as well, who can often provide support and build partnerships in the local area. So once you're ready, go onto our website and click the link to apply. That will take you to an online application form. You can save the form as you go along. And if you have queries while you're filling it in, please get in contact. I can go into our system and look at drafts if you want any comments on what you've written so far. So you're welcome to ask me to read things before you finally submit. That's absolutely fine. So the process is slightly different for small grants and large grants. For small grants, less than £2,000, it's just a single stage process. So the decisions for those are made in early June by our fund panel. And Foundation Scotland will review the application before it goes to the fund panel. And if there's things that need clarification or more information we need, we might get in contact with you, but we don't necessarily get in contact with you. It's only if we feel we need more information on things. So those decisions get made in early June. For large grants, it's a two-stage process. So all the projects are reviewed and assessed against their fit with the fund priorities. And at their meeting in June, the panel then shortlist. And the shortlisted applications go through a full assessment. After the assessment that's done by Foundation Scotland or assessor colleagues of ours who are freelance assessors, a report goes to the panel who make the decision, and the decision will be made in late July on those. So the assessment process, the key thing really is this fit with fund priorities, particularly for large projects, because that's what's going to get you through to the shortlisted stage. So I'll come back to the other things, but if we just first look at the fund priorities. Morag has already mentioned these, but I just want to pull out a couple of more points from them. So there are 4 key priorities. One is around climate smart world. By climate smart, we particularly mean addressing carbon emissions, moving away from fossil fuel use. So we'd expect all our projects to have a climate smart aspect to them. And that can cause some issues with projects that are very worthy, but don't necessarily lead to any reduction in emissions. So an example of that would be, we've quite regularly had applications in for things such as developing paths, developing cycle facilities, and it's been quite difficult to see how they would lead to any carbon reduction emissions. So even though the actual activity is low carbon, we've had applications for things such as paths which are leisure paths, where you'll have to actually drive to get to use the path. So we can't really say from that there's a reduction in carbon emissions. However, if it's a path that is linking up places that will allow people to walk or cycle rather than drive, then we have a clear rationale for funding it, as there would be a reduction in carbon emissions. So if you've got a project that's around cycling or walking, and I think a number of the attendees at this are in those areas, please think about how you're going to establish that your project will save carbon, and make that very clear in the application. So you do need to address that. It's also about investing in community facilities. We do have a lot of applications in for community buildings. If you're applying for community buildings, please base your application on the aspects of the project that are around making the building environmentally sustainable, because the panel generally won't put funding into just a general refurbishment. They want to see the activities that are actually leading to environmental sustainability and fund those activities, whether that's things such as insulation or investing in renewables. So please be specific in your application that it is for those aspects. Support creative solutions, as Morag mentioned, this used to be worded innovative solutions, but we changed that because we wanted to get over that it doesn't have to be a high-tech solution. It's just doing things differently. And the panel want to support projects that just try a different approach. So, for example, we've funded things such as electric cargo bikes that are replacing diesel vans doing short deliveries. And organisations have found that works really well. So it's just testing out things like that. And all the projects have to have some sort of legacy and lasting impact. Now, there are some additional criteria. We used to call these cross-cutting themes, but we felt that was a bit too jargony. So we now just call them additional criteria. Key one of those is around what's called the energy hierarchy. So that's illustrated in the diagram here. It is basically just saying that it's always better to reduce demand, so not use energy in the first place. That's always the most sustainable approach. Lower down the energy hierarchy, you get things like investing in renewables. Now, the implications of this for the programme are that if we've got projects that are coming to us for things such as air source heat pumps, solar PV, we expect them to have good insulation in place first, because we don't want to spend money on renewables if actually the heat's going straight out the roof. And one of the advantages of this fund is that we can be quite flexible in what we fund. So we really want to prioritise an approach that is holistic, so deals with things like insulation as well as renewables. We also want to make good use of other funding sources. So there's no requirement to have match funding as such, but if there's another funding source that would cover what you're applying for, we would expect you to have applied for that. So when it comes to community buildings, one of the major sources that Rachel will be mentioning is Let's Do Net Zero. So that funds up to £80,000 for community buildings, but will only fund 80%. So we could consider putting our funding into the other 20%. Likewise, with Business Energy Scotland, they have grants and loans available. Also, when it comes to the small grants funding energy audits, we wouldn't generally fund an energy audit if it can be done free through Business Energy Scotland. However, if some sort of specialist input is needed that wouldn't be covered by Business Energy Scotland, that's when this fund could consider funding something. We also like to see projects that share knowledge and experience, because one of the big pieces of feedback we've had over the past 4 years of the fund is that the sort of impacts these projects have, it's not just about direct carbon savings, it's about showing other people what can be done. The wider community is generally interested in things like PV, the air source heat pump that goes on buildings, electric cars. People generally want to know about these things. So if you can put something in your project that shows how you're going to share information, that will strengthen it. Then there's the community impacts, because of course it's not just about improving things like community buildings, it's what happens in those community buildings. It's not just about buying an electric vehicle, it's about what's done with the electric vehicle. So how does the project benefit the community, but also how it benefits the organisation? So particularly if it's saving you money on things like your electric bills, how it's making the organisation more sustainable. So those are all additional factors we would usually look at, along with our priorities when we're deciding which projects will go through to the shortlisting stage. Once we have shortlisted and we do a full assessment, the sorts of things we are looking at are things such as your organisational capacity. So how you're going to manage the project, the skills you've got managing the project, your evidence of need, why the work's needed, your project planning, and a real key part here is that you've had some sort of independent advice, particularly for community building projects. So you've had something like a Business Energy Scotland audit that has suggested what are the best approaches to that particular building. Now, we do recognise that there are delays in getting audits at the moment, but we will still expect you to be basing your project on reasonable advice. On the Foundation Scotland website, you'll see requirements regarding quotes to back up costs. So our guidance says that when you apply, you should have 3 quotes if your costs are over £3,000. Now, the panel recognise that at the moment, getting quotes is actually proving really, really difficult. So please don't hold off submitting an application because you haven't got quotes yet. If that's your situation, say you've got 1 quote, base your application on that single quote and go on trying to get further quotes. And when it comes round to us doing the assessment, we can then update the information based on the quotes you've got. If at the time of the assessment you're still really struggling getting quotes, that's not a disaster. We can, if need be, do conditional grants that say a grant is subject to getting quotes. So please don't hold off if you're having trouble actually finding quotes. We look at things like the other sources of funding you've got in. If you've got a lot of other funding to raise, have you got a plan as to how to raise it? We also look at things like timescales and feasibility. This has been a serious issue in a couple of the projects that we've had in. This is an annual fund. We'll be here for many years yet. So we'll prioritise projects that are able to start in the next year. If we think actually this project is going to start in 2 years' time at best, we'll prefer you actually come back next year when it's a little more definite you'll be able to start. And we look at emissions and insurances and the like, as well as what evidence you have about benefits and the impacts of the projects. So those are the sorts of things we look at. Foundation Scotland does a report for the panel who make the decisions on the grants. And the awards, they should normally be spent within 12 months. Now, we do have some flexibility because we know, particularly in the last few years, things haven't always quite gone to plan. But generally, we would expect at least starting within 12 months. We have some requirements on publicity, and sometimes we put in conditions such as things like getting quotes. When the project's finished, there is a reasonably straightforward completion report to complete. But as this is about long-term legacies, we will also come back at some future stage and just see how things are going as well. So that's a very brief run through the process, and questions happy to take at the end. But for the time being, I'm just going to pass over to Rachel, who will talk more about NESCAN and particularly about other funding that's available. So let me just put that on and take the camera off me and put the camera onto Rachel. Thank you.
Hi, I'm the funding and development worker, which means my role within NESCAN is to help build capacity within community groups and communities by accessing funding from different sources. And so I'm looking for people who want to work with me to do applications for as many different types of funding sources as we can, because the more applications we do, the more we learn about how to do them better. And I'm a great believer in you can read all you like, but it's actually doing it that helps you learn about how to do it well. Next slide, please. This is where I find out whether I'd actually switch myself off mute or not. So NESCAN is a network of climate action organisations, and it has a hub which is fully funded by the Scottish Government, which started in about the end of 2021, and it's a community interest, set up as a community interest company. NESCAN is only just over 1 year old. There's, I think, nine members of staff, and we've got a network of started off with 13 members, and I think there's over 100 network members now. I'm not sure of the exact figures. Next slide, please. So, like all organisations, we do all this vision and values and mission stuff, which you can look at our website and see the official version. My unofficial version is that we're aspiring, our vision is a fairer, healthier, sustainable Scotland. And that's looking at, if you think of it in terms of that, we've got 3 global national crises. We've got a cost of living crisis, we've got a mental and other health issues crisis, and we have a climate and biodiversity crisis. And a lot of people say, oh, well, you can't deal with climate issues until we've dealt with the cost of living crisis or all this other crisis. And our view is that to solve any of those, you solve them together. So, for example, the classic is people can't afford to heat their homes, so we need to look at retrofitting to make those homes more energy efficient and look at more sustainable sources of energy. In terms of mental health, and a lot of our health issues are down to environmental issues, climate anxiety, and other pressures on people that we need to look at how we can create a what they politically is called a just transition to a more equitable society. Next slide, please. So how to do this? Basically, our role is to empower communities, to build capacity within communities, to work with communities, to ensure that community views and priorities are represented in decision making. And there's a very nice cartoon, which I don't have a picture of, which is, you know, as an individual, I can't do very much, and governments don't seem to be doing very much. But if we work together as communities, we can maybe have a bit more of an impact. Next slide, please. So our current projects for a young organisation who's been rapidly recruiting new staff members, we seem to have quite a lot on. Climate Week Northeast is something that NESCAN organises every year, took over from Aberdeen Climate Action. So we provide the infrastructure and the brochure and the organisation, but it's actually local community groups who put on the events. And NESCAN is running some community climate assemblies, which is looking at various ways of getting communities involved in deliberative participatory processes and looking at what the options are or what the routes are for having for translating those processes and those action plans into actual impact on decision makers. We have a larger Just Transition Fund deliberative processes project, which was a funding application I wrote to the wider Just Transition Fund, and that is looking at different types of deliberative processes, different ways of engaging with people, because you know, the story everybody will tell you is you can have as many different meetings as you like, but it's all the same people that turn up for them. NESCAN also created a film in partnership with SHMU that highlights various community-based climate projects, and I think there'll be some viewings of that in Climate Week Northeast. We also provide help with funding applications, and we allocate a very, very small, tiny in comparison with the Unlock Our Futures Fund, a very small seed fund. And we work with our network members and partners to encourage and support community climate action. Next slide, please. So this is an invitation to attend some of the events at Climate Week Northeast, which showcase all the different amazing work that people are doing across the Aberdeen City and Shire. And there's an online brochure as well as a paper brochure, so you can find out what's going on near you or in areas or types of projects that you're interested in. Next slide, please. So our seed funding, as the Funding and Development Officer, I recently took over administering this, and we offer very small grants of either 500 or up to 500 or 1,000, depending on how much money we think we've got left in the pot, and that's to kickstart community projects. So we aim to prioritise grassroots community groups and projects that support climate action that might struggle to get funding, and we aim to do a very rapid turnaround, so we make decisions and issue the funding very quickly to eligible projects. So it's on a first come, first served basis. So we've funded different sorts of projects, a lot of them about community food growing, biodiversity, green spaces, things like groups that want to get legal advice about trying to become a community interest company or a different type of legal structure, publicity, training. And the fund closed on the 28th of February. So we've still got all the last minute applications to process. And we will be reviewing the criteria for next year to look at how we can most successfully target the types of projects that are going to have long-term impact and reach the grassroots rather than organisations that have commercial paid fundraisers and grant applicant people to apply officially. Next slide, please. So this is the kind of projects we fund, and I think it's the criteria or the types of projects we're looking to fund are very similar or aligned with the Vattenfall fund. Next slide, please. And we prioritise projects that are aiming to create long-term change and build capacity, and also to encourage partnership working to get groups working together. So one of them might have skills that another group can use, and also to encourage upcycling and reusing and recycling. Next slide, please. So the Just Transition Fund. The Scottish Government, this is the big fund that the Scottish Government has committed. I think it's 500 million. The number's so big that I keep forgetting exactly how many noughts it has on the end. And that's to the northeast over 10 years. The idea being that because the northeast of Scotland is heavily reliant on oil and gas, and if we're going to transition away from oil and gas, it's how to make it a fair transition. And there will be lots of discussions about what is a just transition. How is it going to benefit the communities that are going to be most impacted by the transition? And I think so there'll be lots of jobs moving from one type of job that might be very well paid to maybe less well paid jobs. But there's also a lot of communities that have been impacted by previous unjust transitions. For example, coal's the classic, steel, in the northeast, fishing, and I'm sure you can think of more. So it's looking at how, and each time there's a transition, there's always certain people who are more seriously impacted, and it's looking at how we can address some of those inequalities through the transition. So we see it as an opportunity. So as part of this 500 million fund over 10 years, the government has committed, I think this is correct, but they've correct £1 million a year for the duration of the Parliament, so that's for the next few years, £1 million through green participatory budgeting. And that is going to be shared between local authority areas, Moray, Aberdeen City and Aberdeenshire. Next slide, please. So to administer the Green PB, Scottish Government wanted to encourage partnership working between organisations that have got a long history of working with community groups, and NESCAN, who has a much shorter history, much newer organisation, but has the focus on sustainability and climate action. And the other partners are the Scottish Community Development Centre, who have a lot of skills and expertise in working with communities and good practice. So this fund is from the Scottish Government, and it's being administered by a partnership. And I see the question about when will it reopen. The last year was the first year, and it opened, I think the deadline for applications was July. So the new fund is this next financial year's fund will open at some point, hopefully earlier than last time, because we're very much tied by the two criteria for the Just Transition Fund. Is a capital fund, so they can only fund capital projects, which is very difficult for community groups that might need staff to be able to do anything with capital purchases. And the money has to be spent by the end of the financial year. So that's caused a lot of debate and difficulty with the people accessing the fund, and also with administering the fund. Next slide, please. So the Green PB, this is an example of, these are the outcomes basically from the Green Participatory Budgeting pilot that was run, or first tranche, if you like, that was run in this current soon to end financial year. And these are the Aberdeen City projects. We had a very, very short timescales for this. So the fund only opened for applications at early in October, and they closed again in, I think it was the second week in November. And the projects that were funded have to spend the money by the end of March. So I did a quick, so these are the successful projects in Aberdeen City. And as you can see, electric vehicles did very well, particularly for established organisations, because the voting was citywide. So particularly for organisations where people recognise the name of the organisation. There were a lot of applications for community buildings, and I think the Scout group was the only one that was funded. And then there was quite a lot of successful green spaces applications. Next slide, please. So these are the projects for Aberdeenshire, and this was just sorted in terms of the types of projects again that were funded. So the top, we're looking at I've just color coded them just for the top blue section. Those are all the biodiversity green spaces project. Then 2 more electric vehicles. The retrofitting did better in Aberdeenshire than it did in Aberdeen City. And then there were some waste reduction projects that were also funded. Next slide, please. And this is just have a quick breakdown of the areas where the projects were funded in Aberdeenshire. So one of the big concerns was that because it's participatory budgeting, it looks like a bit of a popularity contest. And that projects for the north, where there are bigger population centres, would do better than smaller population centres. But I think that was the case, that a lot of projects felt they didn't get support because they were a smaller population centre. But I think Banff and Buchan is seen, and Buchan are seen as being quite difficult areas where there's not necessarily the capacity to put projects, organise and put projects together. Next slide, please. Sorry, I'll try and hurry up. Okay, Let's Do Net Zero Community Buildings is one of the big funds for retrofitting community buildings. And I have got, and it's managed by CARES and the Local Energy Scotland, Scottish Government support. Next slide, please. So it is again charitable and community groups who can apply, and including constituted groups that are unincorporated or aren't set up as charities. Next slide, please. And the types of buildings that are available, again, it includes faith-based buildings, but they need to show that there is that can be used and accessed by the community. Next slide, please. And if you remember anything from what I've very rapidly run through, is to reiterate what we said earlier, is that if there is a contact person to talk to about the fund, please speak to them. It can make so much difference for your application. I know we did a lot of work with the Green PB, offering consultations and online support for groups to apply, and it can make so much difference. So that this is appears from the, this, I just got this off the website, and this is the local contact for the Northeast for the Let's Do Net Zero Communities Buildings Fund. I think. Double check it on the website. Thank you. Next slide, please. Okay, so these are our social media handles and my email address, and I am really keen to get to hear from anybody who would like to work with me to do funding applications.